If you're interested in everything with like paleo cooking and whatnot, Sally Fallon's Nourishing Traditions is really good for pretty much everything. You can thumb through it. She talks in the beginning part about each different, like minerals, vitamins, milk, carbohydrates. Talks about some of the problems with what's going on in our culture right now, and then why the cultures before us and like every other culture before us had good food. So Sally Fallon's Nourishing Traditions is really good. Sandor Katz's Wild Fermentation is really good as well for everything fermented. And he alludes to Sally Fallon's Nourishing Traditions many times during the course of this book.
What's fermented mean? I don't know. It's a tricky word.
Fermented.
Bubbly. It means bubbly.
I'm not entirely sure what the actual Webster's definition of fermented is. Do you know?
I could take a stab at it.
Yeah, sure.
I'd say that fermented is anything where it undergoes like a microbiotic or bacterial or fungal process. So you're taking a certain type of food and you're allowing microbiotic life to eat it, and it transforms it into something else. So that can be like kimchi and sauerkraut, it can be cheese, it can be wine. Beer. So there are many different types, right? Some are more yeast-based, like bread can be considered a fermented food. Some breads are more fermented than others.
Like sourdough?
Like sourdough is like a lot more of the same thing going on. But bread in general, what makes it so leavened is the bacteria breathing into the structure of the bread, making it fluffy.
Yeah.
And so in cheese, in making aged cheese, we're definitely utilizing bacterial cultures. They can be pretty significant and complex to take the milk and the curds from the milk and eat them and turn them into different types of stuff. So you all know that there's like thousands and thousands of different types of cheese, and that's really like, there's only a couple different types of milk, but there's tons of different types of cheese, and the process is the fermentation process. The length of time that it ferments, the temperature ranges, the types of bacteria involved, and that's where the subtleties come in, and there's so many variables that you can get something as hard and flaky as Parmesan or as soft as Gouda, and everything in between in the process of making cheese. So I would say that's what fermenting is, the microbiotic.
Yeah, that sounds like a good definition. Yeah. So, and I mean, there's different types of fermentation too, like lactic acid producing things, like kimchi and sauerkraut, and then there's alcohol producing things. And so I would have to say that cheese would fall into the lactic acid.
Yeah, primarily.
Yeah, lactic acid. Yeah.
What is sugar? Is that like,
so
because like when you put that would be the acid.
Well, it could be either or, because if you make sauerkraut improperly, it's going to produce alcohol and not lactic acid, which the lactic acid will actually produce more vitamins than what alcohol would kill off all the vitamins.
There's also acetic acid producing bacteria, which make vinegar, which is acetic acid. So you can turn your wine into vinegar very easily if you have the wrong cultures in it. So that goes from sugar to alcohol to acetic acid.
Yeah.
That's like the stage of the bacteria cultures that go on.
Okay, so I just have a brief history of cheese. They don't really know who or what culture first decided to make cheese, and they don't really know what process it started off. They have records of cheese making being made up to 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, though. And it's mentioned in ancient Greek mythology, and there's evidence of cheese making in ancient Egyptian murals that date up to 4,000 years ago. But they weren't making the cheeses that we know today. The cheeses that we know today are only about 500 years old. The first factory cheese making was in 1815, and it was in Switzerland. And there are 5 different components that make up milk: water, lactose, which is sugar essentially, fats, proteins and minerals. And the proteins are split up into two different types: whey, which is the more watery, and casein, which is the more solid. So when you're making cheese, it's essentially you're just separating the whey protein from the casein protein, and so you're getting a firmer product. Where in like yogurt, you're essentially just kind of expelling a small amount of whey so that it gets a little bit thicker, so it's a different bacteria. So yeah. And then the higher the moisture content, the shorter the lifespan. So the harder your cheese is, the longer the shelf life is. The softer
And
it is.
yeah, long-aged cheeses tend to become drier and drier over time. That's oftentimes why they coat them in wax to try to, after they've undergone and become stable in their temperature to remain soft, they coat them in wax so that there's not a vapor. There's a vapor barrier so that it stays soft, despite it being aged for a long time. So you'll see a lot of the aged cheeses that I'll show you that I've made. They're all the same kind of aged cheese, but they don't have any outer coating on them. They just have a natural crust that is formed from the salt, the salt from brining precipitating out. And so they're much drier, much harder. They're sort of like a hockey puck. You could probably throw them against a wall and it wouldn't break. In that way they're more like Parmesan or something like that. But you can still cut them. So they have softness like a cheddar, but they're a little drier and flakier like Parmesan.
Yeah, and there are two main different types of cheeses that you can make quite easily. An acid cheese, which is what we're going to make today, or a rennet cheese, which is made from an enzyme in the lining of a calf's stomach. You can also get different vegetarian forms of rennet, stinging nettle being one of those.
Yarrow.
Yarrow, yeah. They just don't work as well as rennet does.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is how do you separate the casein from the whey, or the milk solids, which are protein and fat, from the whey, or make curds in the whey? How do you do that? And so you can do that with acid, and that's a chemical process, right? A non-biotic process. And then you have rennet, which is the enzymes that are produced in the stomachs of weanling animals that are being fed. So it produces lactase, which is the enzyme that takes lactose, which is milk sugar, out. It breaks it down to lactic acid. And in the process also curdles the milk, meaning separating the solids from the liquid portions of it. And then with plant-based renneting agents, you're doing a similar thing as the enzymes, that there are actually chemicals in the plants that fulfill similar functions and perform similar actions as the enzymes that are in the weanling animal stomachs. So traditionally with rennet, they would actually butcher a young animal that was still nursing, and they'd take the stomach, cut it open, and dry it. And when they were making cheese, they would add a little piece of that dried stomach in there, and the enzymes that had dried and that were just there sitting on the surface of the stomach would then act out. Nowadays you can get a little bottle. I didn't bring it out because it's relatively temperature sensitive, so you want to keep it cold, otherwise it denatures and becomes ineffective. You can get a bottle of juice that you dilute and add to the cheese. But a traditional way to do it is simply to dry the stomach and use that.
Or to actually add the milk into the calf's stomach.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
another traditional way.
Yeah, traditional way of doing it.
Shake it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, why do we add the milk into the stomach? Like, as it's before you butcher it?
No. So you would butcher the animal, and then I would imagine clean the stomach to a certain extent, and then just pour it in and shake it up, tie it off, let it hang out there for a day.
Hang it up in your cheese making shop, and then cut it open later, and you would have.
Probably put it on
curds
the
and wine.
saddle and go.
It is a good way to make cheese on the hoof.
Yeah, definitely. Well, especially if you've got a herd of animals that you're taking somewhere, right? And you not only have an airtight sack to carry your cheese around, it's making it as you go.
Would you like to start this process with the cheese and explain that a little bit so that it can be heating up and whatnot as we
I
continue?
thought that it was, okay. So, essentially you just put the milk and, again, raw, whole, and if you can get it unpasteurized milk is the best. To make cheese, just because it already has a small amount of enzymes and bacteria that are gonna help your cheese to just become cheesier faster.
So what you're going to be making is a soft, unaged cheese, what could be called a farmer's cheese, and what is going to be a vinegar cheese. So we use vinegar, or apple cider vinegar particularly, as the agent to separate the curds from the whey. So this is a very simple way that you can make a soft cheese, like chev, which is like what you can spread on bread. Chev is actually is aged for a period of time. This is an unaged cheese, so it's a little bit more tighter bound. It's not as cultured, you could say, uncultured cheese. Check this.
Now that's your little propane burner you got there.
Get it down.
Good job.
One thing about raising the temperature of milk is that you don't want it to get too hot too fast.
Yeah.
Because you can tend to scald it at the bottom and then the other stuff won't be hot. So you want to stir often, and you want to make sure that you're raising the temperature. A rule of thumb is like 1 degree a minute. You know, this is kind of overkill. We have this like humongous turkey baster and we're trying to heat a gallon of milk.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be like a little crazy. But this is the milk that we got this morning from Becca. So it's really great if you milk and then you make cheese because it comes out of the animal at like 85, 90 degrees.
Yeah.
And so you only need to heat it a little bit to make cheese.
You could almost just even take it from the animal and not really heat it at all and make cheese with it.
Question for you. Did you get that whole gallon of milk out of one goat this morning?
A bit more.
A bit more, but that's out of 3 goats.
Yeah.
It's really out of 2 goats, and then there's this other goat that produces a little bit of milk. Yeah, so right now we're getting maybe 1.5 gallons, 1.25 gallons of milk out of 2 does in a 12-hour period, and we're letting the kids have the rest of the milk. So they're probably producing maybe twice that amount, less than twice that amount, in a day, in a 24-hour period.
And just milk the goats in the morning, or you milk them twice?
We are just milking them once a day, and then the kids, their children, just get to feed on the milk for the rest of the day.
If you had a cow without calves, then you would have to definitely milk them twice a day, or even if there weren't any kids for the goat, just because the mothers are still producing milk and that can get really uncomfortable, their udders. So yeah, but
you run the risk of infection in the udder if you allow milk to sit there and not be moved. Allow the milk and the blood that's in the udders not to move around.
So the kids are separated at night. That's how you keep them
Right.
away from, prevent them from feeding. The kids are separated at night, and then during the mothers are milked in the morning, and then the kids are put back in for the rest of the day, and then again separated at night, and so they accumulate milk overnight.
Yeah, because I didn't even know, because I just saw them going all over the place. I wondered.
So that's during the day they do.
Like, how do you even catch them? They're just all over the place.
oh, they just come to you.
They want to get milked.
Yeah,
They do.
They do. Yeah, they get excited. They're like, "Oh, you're here now! Yay!"
Yeah. So, do you have more that you want to say to this, or I can? start talking?
Yeah. No, I mean, like you seem like you're comfortable, so.
Okay. Well, for the soft cheese, we're gonna try to get it to like 140, 120.
185.
185?
Just before boiling is when you want it. Yeah. Yeah. That's the optimal range for separation.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the most curd
Yeah.
at that temperature.
Yeah.
Like it's like this comes to the top, it gets like bubbly, doesn't it?
Yeah. Almost.
Almost
Yeah.
bubbly.
Yeah. Pretty much.
You also want to make sure that your thermometer isn't touching the bottom of the pan because it'll give an inaccurate reading. You want it to be right in the middle of milk,
Yeah.
preferably.
Thank you.
Keeping it covered helps it retain heat.
Yeah.
Right, so you can do it really easily by just looking at it and be like, oh, it's about to boil, bam.
Yeah.
You don't need a thermometer when you know what you're doing. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah.
It will curdle at different temperatures.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to
Yeah.
be an exact science when you're making soft, unaged cheese.
Yeah.
And it can be a process that you do regularly if you have goats, and you can make cheese just in the morning, really simply and easily. Okay. So that's making unaged cheese. I can talk a little bit now about the process of making aged cheese that I am using, but I want to just point out that there's like thousands of ways to make cheese, and this is just one process, and it works well for me in the flow of my day. It is a traditional recipe taken from a Swiss farmer, Swiss cheesemaker, that I learned from someone who went back to Switzerland. He's from Switzerland originally.
Yeah, so it's kind of frightening.
And it's all available on the Windward website. I just put it up maybe 2 months or 3 months ago. It's called Genuine Swiss Goat Cheese. If you just go to the notes on the home page and just scroll down, you'll find it. And the recipe is all there laid out. But I can run through it right now just so you have a sense of what the process is and why I'm doing certain things at certain times. So to make that cheese, I'll take like a gallon of milk. It's usually like the unit that I use, and I'll show you the cheeses that makes. And I put it in a pot and I heat it to 100 degrees. And this is a cheese that utilizes mesophilic bacteria. That means they like the median range of temperatures. These are things that feed off of milk, and they like the medium range of temperatures, which is like 85 to 100 degrees.
So meso is in like mezzo soprano. And
Sure, in the middle.
Yeah.
As opposed to thermophilic, which is like hotter temperatures, and whatever is before that, I don't know. I don't know if they even
I don't
exist.
think there is, no.
Maybe they do.
Cool.
So mesophilic bacteria are often the bacteria that are used to make softer, or creamy sort of aged cheese. So if you think of cheddar cheese, think of provolone cheese, these are all mesophilic. And thermophilic bacteria are generally used to make harder cheeses like Parmesan, or I don't know, like other cheeses that are like much harder to cut. They don't have that creamy sort of consistency to them, and they usually have a harder crust. And that's just the nature of the bacteria and the bacterial processes that go on over a long period of time in the culturing process. So in making this cheese, I heat the milk up to 100 degrees, and I add a small amount of starter. I add 1/4 of a teaspoon of starter culture, which is powdered bacteria, basically. That's all it is.
Where do you get it?
I get it from the New England Cheesemaking Company, the New England Cheese Company, which is like one of the biggest organizations in the United States for home cheesemaking. And they have a website, it's like cheesemaking.com. And they've been around since the 70s. They're sort of back to the landers. They brought together a lot of knowledge, a lot of traditional knowledge about cheesemaking. And their website has got tons of information on it. And I'm forgetting the name of the author. I should have brought her book over. But she has a book called Home Cheesemaking. And it's like definitive. It has over 160 cheeses in it, recipes. And it gives resources about every stage that you can possibly think of in making cheese. And lots of nifty little traditional ways that cheese have been made in the past, and little tricks and tips and all sorts of stuff. What's up?
So is the starter of is it the bacteria?
Yep. It is the culture, it's the bacteria that you're adding to the milk. And so that
Can you stretch that as well? Like, can you make your
Grow more.
Yeah, grow more.
you can definitely grow more starter. That's an in-depth process that I don't understand well enough to teach. But in home cheesemaking and on cheesemaking.com, there's plenty of resources, and it's something that is done quite often.
Wouldn't you just be able to save some of the whey like you would in yogurt making?
You potentially can, but again, I don't know enough to teach about it, so I'm not going to try to.
Something to play with.
Something to play with. It's
Yeah.
certainly possible. People have not had freeze-dried packets of culture and made cheese perfectly fine for thousands of years. So
Yeah.
obviously
Do you have
there's
to
ways
store it
to do
at specific temperatures? Because sometimes bacteria are fragile
Hmm.
when they're dried.
I freeze the culture and it doesn't seem to make any difference. So I think as long as they're dried and dormant,
Keep
they
it
can
cold.
withstand a variety of different temperatures and just hang out.
Yeah. Well, it's like packaged yeast, right? They have a shelf life like anything, so
Yeah,
you keep them
cold,
cold.
they
They
last
last
longer.
longer, yeah. And
Yeah.
certain different types of yeast are more
Mhm.
fragile than others.
Mhm.
So.
So to move through that aged cheese process some more, so I heat it to 100 degrees, I add a little bit of starter, make sure it's thoroughly mixed in, and then I stick it in an insulated box. We call it a hay box. It's basically a wooden box and it's wrapped in wool inside of it. So I stick the pot and it's just an insulated box because you want the culture, this is called a culturing process. I'm allowing the bacteria to multiply in the milk. And that helps to make sure that it's got a good start. Like before I do anything else with the cheese, I just make sure that there's a strong, healthy colony of the bacteria that I want inside of it. Because if there's other sorts of bacteria in there, then when I set it on the shelf for 3 weeks, who knows what's going to happen inside of there. It could do terrible things could happen. So this is the culturing process. I leave it in that insulated box. That helps it remain at the right temperature, which is like 100 degrees. That's like on the hotter end of what the mesophilic bacteria want. But it also means that the higher the temperature, the faster they'll reproduce. Right? It's like a logarithmic curve of reproduction. As you increase temperature, you kind of exponentially increase the amount of reproduction that happens. So you want it to be at a relatively warm temperature for the culturing process. Otherwise, you need it to stay longer in there, and you stand the risk of other things potentially multiplying.
How do you know it's the right bacterial culture?
I have a little freeze-dried packet that says
Yeah, but you
mesophilic
said, what
bacteria.
if it gets contaminated? What if, you touch it on your hands and you get a little staph or something on it?
I don't really know. I just, it looks bad.
So what
smells
happens?
bad.
It
What
smells
happens
bad.
with that is most bacteria that is like staph, certain negative bacteria won't be able to live past body temperature. So that's why when you have an infection, you get a fever. That's your body's way of killing all of the bad bacteria. Where if it killed all your good bacteria, then you'd essentially die because you're more bacteria than you are cells. So definitely when he heats that up to 100 or 110 degrees, all of
Not going to
essentially,
110 degrees.
Yeah.
It's too hot.
but in between, like from 100 to over body temperature,
Okay.
essentially, you're effectively killing off the majority of the bad bacteria, and then the good bacteria that you're introducing and colonizing will be the cleanup crew, because they want the space, they want that food source, they don't want to share it with anyone else, so they're gonna, wage war on all of that. So.
So this process, you culture it for an hour at 100 degrees in that box, and then I take that, after an hour of allowing the bacteria to reproduce, I go through a renneting process. So I'm using animal rennet because it's really good, it works really well, and it doesn't introduce acidity to the cheese, because I don't want to add the acidity into the cheese because it'll screw with the bacteria. They want a nice even pH, and then as the cheese cures, they will transform the lactose into lactic acid, increasing the pH until it becomes too acidic for any bacteria to really live in. So you want that to happen gradually. You get a better, mellower, tastier cheese if you allow that process to happen slowly, as opposed to all at once. And if you put acid on it right away, and you age it, you're probably going to have other types of bacteria that aren't the mesophilic bacteria growing in there. Or it'll be fungal based as opposed to bacterial based, and you'll get mold, basically black mold. And so, usually the milk is still at 100 degrees when I'm adding the rennet. And that's really great because the rennet is an enzyme. It lives naturally inside of an animal. That animal is 99 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees. Usually, ruminants their body temperatures are a little bit hotter than ours, just on average, a couple degrees. So that 100 degrees is a really great temperature. It's optimal for a renneting process. Any cooler than that, it happens really slowly and not completely, so you have more of the casein and the milk solids in the way still. And any hotter than that, and you run the risk of the enzymes denaturing and becoming ineffective, because they're real fragile, right? And you need them to be in this really tight temperature range to be effective. And you go hotter than that, it disappears. Like they just break down. And then, so that renneting process, I basically put the rennet in. For a gallon of milk, I use about half a teaspoon of rennet, and I dilute it in like a cup of water, and I get it nice and mixed in. And I pour it in there over a slotted spoon, and I stir it really well for like a minute. Make sure that it gets all the enzyme, because there's just a little bit of enzyme is required, but it needs to be all the way through the milk diffusely. So the more you stir it, the better. And it takes about 2 minutes for the renneting process to really kick in. So you have about a minute or so you can like be mixing in, and you won't have any separation.
At that point that you're adding the rennet into the cup of water to mix that before you put it into your pot, do you, the temperature of that water, do you have to keep the same as?
Yeah, so I usually have the water at about 100 degrees.
Yeah.
Luckily, the water that comes out of our hot water heater, it comes out at 100 degrees.
You're not
So
worried
it's
about
perfect.
the bacteria in that water?
Not particularly, because we're about to dump it into a cultured ecosystem where there's already established bacteria. That's part of the culturing process. It helps foolproof the cheese making. So, you know, whenever you're making cheese, it's good to have like basic hygiene, you know, like wash your hands and make sure the pots have been washed with hot soapy water, etc. But you don't need to be like in a laboratory kind of thing. That's not necessary. People have been making cheese on the saddle of their horse for a long time, and it still works. It's mostly it's a numbers game. It's a statistical game. You put a bunch of good bacteria that you want in there, and they will colonize the space. And that's how that works. It's biology more than anything else.
And then the flavoring too that you give to cheeses. So I don't know about Andrew's cheese, but the cheese that we're going to make today is going to be made with garlic and rosemary. And garlic is very antiviral, antibacterial. So I mean, like any aging that we do to this cheese, it's not really going to grow any more bacteria, especially not any unwanted bacteria. So that's something too, you can mediate what happens to your cheese after with the flavoring agents you give to it. As well as salting the cheese will also help bacteria from colonizing.
That's the primary way that I use to make sure that bad bacteria don't infiltrate the cheese in the curing process, is how you do a brining. Right, so in renneting the cheese, I basically open the lid while it's still in the insulated box. It's at 100 degrees. I add that rennet and stir it in, and I put the lid back on, and I just let it sit there for an hour again. I come back, and usually, if the insulation has been added, and it's still about 100 degrees, maybe it's cooled off. There's a curd that is formed, and that's a solid, because I'm using a circular pan, it's a circular disc within the pan, or within the pot. It's floating free of the sides, in the way. That's the way you can tell that you've done a really good job, is that it's not sticking to the sides, that all of the casein and the proteins have gone, and they've like scrunched together, and they've gotten smaller than the diameter of the pot. So if you go in there and it's still sticking to the sides, and that you still have a good temperature range, you can leave it there a little bit longer, and it should, optimally, become a free floating disc, right? And so at that point in time, I cut the curds, and I take that curd in the pot, and I just cut it into 1.5 inch or 1 inch cubes. And that just increases the surface area and allows a little bit more renneting to take place, and it gives the cheese a good texture for pressing. So you don't want like a huge solid curd, right? You want it to